The antidote.
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 Y estás escuchando The Antidote.
The antidote.
The antidote.
The antidote.
You're listening to The Antidote with Dave Hawkins.
With Christian music that doesn't suck.
Hey, this is Dave Hawkins. Welcome to The Antidote. For tonight, I'm going to break from The Antidote's typical routine of having an opening song. This is one of those times when I wish, there was more than just 60 minutes in an hour, but I don't think that's going to change. Because I've got a lot of incredible music and conversation coming up on tonight's show. All bands really are an accumulation of its parts. Some bands have it all together, others never get it together. At least in my eyes. Then there's some who take it to the top. That's the case with Fleshkiller. The band is made up of members from Extol, The Burial, Tristania, Shining, and Umfell, making Fleshkiller a legitimate supergroup. This is a band who knows how metal should be made. I had a long talk with Fleshkiller vocalist Elijah Mullins about the band, and also about the music history of their band members. Fleshkiller's Awaken album was my most anticipated of 2017, and guess what? It's even better than I hoped for. You're going to love this. Elijah Mullins, guitarist and vocalist with Fleshkiller, joins The Antidote. Thanks for coming, Elijah.
Hey, thanks for having me.
It's been a couple years since we last spoke, and at that point, you were frontman for the technical metal band The Burial. Now, a lot has changed for you since then.
Yeah, it's been a long couple of years, actually. I think the last time you and I talked, I had literally just gotten engaged.
You had just done that.
Yeah, it was like that day. I had gotten engaged. And I was thinking about that because I was like, that was almost 3 years ago.
Too funny.
No kids on the scene yet, but still happily married. Yeah, just since then, it's kind of been a bit of a whirlwind as far as, everything that had happened. I was touring with War of Ages at the time as well. I was playing bass for them for a while. Yeah, and then, got married and kind of realized, wow, time really does fly when you start settling down a little bit.
And have you actually settled down? Tell us the truth.
I'd say I'm about 60% settled down, maybe. It's something near to that nature. There's definitely the refining quality that comes along with being married that I would take zero credit for myself. That was all my wife helping me.
So now you're this staid, conservative guy.
Yeah, the white picket fence and the small dogs, that sort of thing.
Can you tell us how Fleshkiller came to be and how you became a part of the band?
Yeah, the band itself is pretty much Ulla Barud's kind of like baby, really. And it was more or less birthed out of a place where after Extol had sort of reunited and done that record in 2013, they're self-titled with Face Down, they kind of found themselves at a point where he wanted to play live, David wanted to play live, but Peter couldn't really do it live. Not that he couldn't do the music, but he just couldn't commit to touring. And so they did a couple, small shows as Extol after that happened. But, he had kind of gotten the bug back. He hadn't been playing metal for a while. And, once he started again, it was hard to get him to stop. And so he just started cranking out these songs, which eventually became the Fleshkiller record. A lot of that just was a process of him having this sort of desire and just like a relit fire to start playing metal again. So that's where he sort of got the ball rolling, so to speak. As far as the other members go, he had initially asked a guy named Peter Dahlbach, who played for a band called Shaliak back in the day. And Peter was going to do that record on vocals. And so it was just more or less going to be those two dudes. And then Peter couldn't because other commitments that he had made. So, he thought he could, kind of manage both and couldn't. In a pinch, Ulla happened to remember that, oh, hey, there was that band that was on Face Down, came out around the same time as, Extol's last record. I think I'll talk to him, and him and I had chatted a couple times about different metal and things like that, but had never met in person. and he asked me if I was willing to do the record. And I said, yeah, that'd be really fun. This sounds like a cool record to do. So I went and recorded the vocals. And then after the fact, he was like, well, hey, if we ever did this thing live, would you want to play guitar and do vocals like you did in the Burial? And I was like, yeah, that's fair. I'll do that. And I wasn't really thinking in terms of this was actually going to happen or anything like that, because I'm the only American in the band. Everybody else is from Norway. And so just logistics, I didn't figure we'd actually end up doing a whole lot live. And then, cue to a week later, he calls me and says, hey, by the way, here's your tickets. You're coming to Norway to shoot a music video. and you're coming back in October to do a couple festivals. So we're getting kind of ramped up for that. So that's my story of how I got in. And then the other fellas, Andreas, I know he had been around in the studio scene and kind of has made a little bit of a name for himself in that area in Oslo. And he's a young kind of upcoming dude. He's real young, but the kid's a monster on drums. And then our bassist, Ulla Vistnes, he actually plays bass for a band called Shining from Norway. They're what do they call themselves? It's kind of a quirky, they call themselves black jazz, I think, right now. But they're very experimental, very fun music, and really cool dudes, and I'm glad to have gotten to know them over the past couple months here.
And how does it work for you being the only American in the band, with the rest of them being Norwegian? Do they give you a hard time because you are American?
Oh, yeah. It's funny. They don't give me too much of a hard time, but it is funny when we were shooting a music video, we were in there rehearsing, and we start talking about different parts. And, I had been practicing the parts for a few months, but then they'll start talking to each other about parts, but it's all in Norwegian, which I have no idea what's going on. So they'll go for a few minutes and then realize like, oh crap, Elisha doesn't understand anything we just said. So one of them will have to turn and translate for me.
Well, see, what you've really got to do is you have to learn Norwegian just so that, when these guys are bad-mouthing you behind your back, you'll be able to understand it.
Yeah, exactly. I can't get left out in the lurch here.
Here comes your introduction to the sound of Fleshkiller. From their just-released Awaken album, Is True Image. You mentioned about X-Stool, and I think this question has got to be on everybody's mind. Is Fleshkiller simply a reincarnation of X-Stool, or is it more than that?
I think it's fair to ask, just because it does seem like it's a bit of a new pop-up of sort of the same thing. And I guess I should mention, too, that our bassist did play for X-Toll in those few live shows. So there are a couple little connections there, but musically there's quite a bit going on that I don't think X-Toll would have done some of the things that Fleshkiller's doing. And I think part of that is because of this fresh sort of itch that Ulla has for metal right now. And also, I think it's something that maybe flies under the radar a bit, but there was a lot of collaborative stuff going on with X-Toll as well. So in a lot of bands, there's usually like a few driving forces behind songwriting, just because in metal it's hard to keep things straight if you don't do that. But X-Toll was a very sort of like equal contributor type situation where you had David writing guitar parts even, and things of that nature, where the band really worked as a whole. So us not having David in the band, I think, definitely sort of distinguishes it from being a sort of X-Toll reincarnation, especially considering David's actually starting a new project with a few people right now. It's sort of flying under the radar, but it's really, really good. And he's met back up with the other guitarist from X-Toll, Krister. And so those guys have kind of started their own project, but still distinct. Even that stuff doesn't really feel like a reincarnation of X-Toll so much as a natural sort of progression of what the members of X-Toll have kind of come up to at this point.
Well, something that's going to make Fleshkiller distinct is that really the band members end up making Fleshkiller a supergroup. Same way as Broken Social Scene, Foo Fighters, or the Traveling Wilburys, how they came together. Because really, you've all been in significant, artistic bands.
Yeah, and I think that experience does kind of lend itself to a smooth process. I mean, this is 100% the smoothest process of joining and learning music and, just like clicking with a group of guys, just because we've all been here before. We've all done something of this nature, at least to some degree. So I think you're right in that regard. I think, to be fair to both the Ullas, they've both had quite a bit more of the super in the word supergroup than I think I have. But those guys are really top-notch musicians. And so when you're coming into something and you've got guys that you already respect as artists, and have something, really excellent to bring to the table, it makes you want to do better. It makes you want to put better music out. So it's something that I was kind of conscious of coming in, and I knew that I wanted to make sure that I was up to the task for it.
Well, we should get into talking about specifically about the band members, as you were talking about with, Ulla Brod. He's been X-Stoll from the band's early days. The band had a really diverse sound and a huge reputation.
Yeah, and it's one of those things that they did stuff that no band was doing. They got a lot of recognition, and I think it was all deserved, but I think people sometimes maybe miss why they got so much recognition. What they had going on was that in that era, there were a lot of bands who did things that were like, oh, this is the band that sounds like insert other band here. And X-Toll wasn't one of those bands. When you flipped that album on, you went, oh, this is different. This is unique. They were pushing boundaries that bands, no matter what their religious persuasion, hadn't pushed. And because of that, they garnered that sort of respect in and outside of the Christian metal scene. They had it inside because everybody loved them. And then outside of it, you had fairly big people looking at these guys saying, hey, they're doing something unique. They're doing something legitimate. And that sort of thing, I think, is what propelled them to the top, really, is that essence. You could hear things that they did that no other band was doing. And I still think a lot of bands kind of chase, but haven't quite grasped.
A fusion is conceived through synchronizing faith.
It's impossible to choose only one song from Extol to really represent their music. After all, Extol is iconic. But that was my pick, Structure of Souls. Now, Elijah has a lot more to share about his bandmates on this next part of our chat. And another interesting point about Burritt is that he doesn't only do metal. He's put out quite a bit of solo stuff over the past couple of years. But talk about a change from metal. It's this blend of jazz, funk, soul, and pop. Was this really just him trying to stretch his art?
Yeah, I think to some extent there is that. Also, I think there's just a lot of that comes from, for him, his whole family is very musical, a large musically inclined background. And that just sort of oozes through, especially when you see him playing in his solo stuff. He looks just as comfortable as he does, when he's playing metal. And that's because he's been doing it as long as he's been alive. As long as him and his family have been around, they've been making music, no matter what genre they've got going on. And as far as the metal goes, I think it was kind of just a right place, right time sort of thing for him. There's a lot of that just like testosterone of youth that sort of itches you and wants you to listen to that heavy stuff. In that same way, you listen to the sorts of things that sort of scratch that itch. You've got a little bit of an underlying foundation in music that never really goes away just because you start listening to metal.
And how's your testosterone level running now?
It's funny. The amount of like really heavy stuff I listen to now is a lot lower than it used to be. And I found that if something's gonna catch my attention, it's either got to be really, really well crafted or really, really aggressive. It's got to be like one extreme or the other. But if it grabs you by the head and just won't let you go, that seems to be something that grabs me.
Okay, then let's really put it on to you personally. If you were coming into Fleshkiller, knowing nothing about the band, and you were hearing the sound, how does it rate?
Oh, man. So that's actually one of the fun things about the way I came into this project is most of the music was already written pretty much. So I can say with, a good bit of outside objectivity that I was stoked when I heard it. I was really glad to hear the kind of stuff it was, because it is a little bit of that earlier thrashy, old school death metal kind of vibe in essence. Now it's obviously way more polished and way more, professionally done. Like, we still took our time in the studio and, did all of the proper things you have to do to make a record sound good, which, the guys in the 90s weren't really that concerned about. But in essence, a lot of the structure, a lot of the attitude is that old school Florida, early 90s death metal stuff. And that for me is like my bread and butter. I love old bands like Death and Cynic and Atheist and a lot of those like old.
You're really going back.
Yeah. That was sort of the stuff. Even though most of those albums came out, like the year I was born. It was still something that caught my attention when I first started listening to metal. And I'm glad it did, because that stuff was a little rougher around the edges to listen to. But because I listened to it first, I didn't care about that. Like, I didn't care that the drums didn't sound as good as, XYZ's record or, insert any modern band, whatever. I didn't care. I wanted the attitude. I wanted that gnarly sort of just, get out of the way thrash that turned into death metal. And that's something that Fleshkiller has that I think is something that also distinguishes it from the X-Toll stuff. There's a little bit more just hair on the edges as far as like, oh man, that's a little more aggressive than I would expect from an X-Toll record, or that's a little more rough around the edges maybe.
We got to talk about the other Ulla, Visnes.
Oh, yeah.
Was in X-Toll, but then also with that dark goth metal with Tristania.
Yeah.
I can't get into that band. That's just too depressing for me.
It was too dark, It's funny because there is this sort of I don't know if it's the weather or what it is about the Scandic countries up there, but I guess Canada's got some of that too. I think it is something in the air that just makes people go like, oh yeah, that hits a spot. But then I'm like, well, if the hottest it ever got all year long was 70 degrees and 90% of the year there was like hardly any sunlight and it was really cold all the time, like, I think maybe I'd be singing slow sad songs about it too.
Oh, come on. It hasn't been that warm in Illinois this year either. It's been cool everywhere.
No, yeah, it's been pretty nice. I run a little warm by nature, so my poor wife, she would love it if it was like 85 degrees all year long. And I'm like, no, we set the thermostat at 68 degrees. But yeah, all that to say, it brings an interesting perspective to the band, that's for sure.
Your drummer, Andreas, coming from the band Omphel. And I mean, I never would have heard of the band if one of the listeners to The Antidote hadn't turned me onto their music. Their album Cactus is, I guess you'd say it's esoteric. It is prog metal, but it brings in all these other influences. He
is so like reserved about the sorts of things he does, and it's kind of funny too because he's not like a metal by nature kind of guy. He's very reserved, very quiet. Like we were walking around in Oslo when we were going to get our pictures taken and get all the promo shots done. And we all show up and we've got our black leather jackets and our black t-shirts and our black jeans and our black boots. And Andreas comes very well dressed, a nice light blue top and some jeans and just very politely mannered. And he was like, I do not feel metal enough to be in this band. He turned and told me.
And that's why you stuck him in the very background of the picture.
Yeah, we're like, hey, get to the back, Andy.
I realize that I may have come across as a bit negative about the music of Umphel, but really I'm not. The band is both excellent and, as you found out, non-typical. And you heard that on their song Fly, Fly. Elijah gets a chance to speak about his own background as frontman for The Burial, and I'll give you my favorite track from the band, Pearls, The Frailty of Matter. We're saving the best here for last. Mr. Elijah Mullins, as frontman for The Burial. That's probably one of the tightest bands I've ever seen.
Oh, thank you.
Did The Burial get to the place where you wanted it to be?
You know, I think it did. And it's a weird sort of way of looking at it, but we never really made music that we thought would take us, on huge tours or, sell loads and loads of albums. And Jason from Facedown was, super gracious about it with us. He was just kind of like, look, guys, like, I know what you are. I know what I signed up for in signing you guys. He knew he wasn't getting, the next 4 today when he signed us. Mm-hmm. But we had something that he liked, and we had a good relationship with him, so he let us write what we wanted to write. I can say that I'm pretty proud of what we did. I don't think it's finished, is the only thing I'd say. I know Caleb, our drummer, had a few other things that he's got, his hands in, and just all the other members in general have a couple things that they've got their hands in that couldn't really ever revive it to a full-scale sort of thing like we once were. But I don't know that we're 100% done as far as writing music goes. But I will say part of the reason that we haven't actively sort of pushed forward is we were really satisfied with what we did musically. And we didn't want to compromise the next time around and find out that, we actually like that last record we did better. We wouldn't want to put out a new record and then look back and say, you know what, In the Taking of Flesh was still better, so maybe we shouldn't have bothered putting this one out. Till we get to that, I think we're kind of just hanging on and making sure we really have something we want to do.
And it would be hard just to, put the brakes to it and say that's the end of it, because it's been, 8-9 years since the band started?
Oh, yeah. They had been around for quite a while before Caleb and I ever showed up. And Todd, our other guitarist, he's been doing this for, forever. So, I mean, it was probably closer to 10 or 11 years, honestly. Because I remember one of the first years I went to Cornerstone was 2005, 2006, somewhere in there. Mm-hmm. And The Burial was one of the bands I saw. Todd and the other members that I eventually started playing with were out there just playing Generator stages, like getting their name out there wherever they could. And, eventually that landed them on the Facedown imprint with, I think it was called Strike First Records. That's how The Burial kind of got their foot in the door in a lot of places at Cornerstone. And then, a few years later I was playing with them. But that was 10, 11 years ago, at least.
Does that put Fleshkiller into a fairly narrow niche, or is there going to be a broad enough group of people that are going to want to hear this?
It's interesting. Maybe like 5 or 6 years ago, I would have said that, it's a tiny, narrow niche that like nobody really wants to be a part of. And I think I would have been right. But right about this time, it seems that the extremes of metal have been changing. And those sorts of things come and go with time. There's the extremes of, who can have the darkest themes or who can be the loudest and, the most rowdy. And I think our extreme right now has kind of swung to a point where the extreme is extreme skill and proficiency with things. So if you look at the bands that are really pushing the edge right now and really getting a lot of traction, a lot of them are bands that are almost 100% prog and like hardly metal if you really like dug down into it. Bands like Animals as Leaders, who are obviously really heavy, and they're kind of the big thing on the market right now. Mm-hmm. But those guys are like insane, super talented musicians, and that's the extreme that's grabbing kids right now. And so because of that, I feel like it does open the market a little bit for other bands who would have been more traditionally just heavy bands to kind of put their foot in the door. Another example of that would be a band called Revocation. That I love their last album, Great Is Our Sin, but that record has so much cool like jazz guitar on it, but just with the distortion cranked to 11. It wouldn't be weird to see those guys on a tour with like Slayer or something, just really thrashy, really old school metal, but they've still got that prog element. They've got that sort of thing. So I feel like we'd probably fit in somewhere within that realm, where we're trying to touch on that extreme of being excellent at what you do and kind of taking that to its extreme while still retaining some of the songwriter elements. Because I don't think you can push that extreme too far without kind of ending up alienating some people along the way.
Then it's not effectively a one-man band with stellar musicians coming in. It really is a community effort.
Oh, no, yeah, and that's something that he wanted to sort of produce with us in that way. After we got to talking and, sort of got the vibe that we were both really on the same page as far as this goes, it sort of turned into like, well, hey, how about instead of that, you just join the band and you help, like make this what it is. I think that kind of solidified it for everybody involved that, hey, we all want to be able to put our stamp on this and say, maybe this time around it was a unified sort of undertaking that Ulla sort of spearheaded, but we've still got, our little signatures here, our little signatures there that wouldn't have happened otherwise.
Well, something that was true of both The Burial and Extol is the Christian message in the music. And I mean, that faith aspect is also there in Fleshkiller. Is that message intentionally part of the music on the Awaken album?
I would say that it's rather intentional. I don't know if it's necessarily as focused in the sense that it feels like we've got a particular mission with what we're trying to say, as much as it is just when we as Christians search within ourselves and put some art onto paper, one way or the other, that reflection naturally sort of comes out. It would be weird, I think, for me anyways, to try and write lyrics that didn't somehow reflect the way I look at the world. And primarily the way I look at the world is through the lens of my faith in Christ. And I could say that for the other members of the band as well. This is more just a natural sort of reflection of what comes out when, I think about certain topics, or, if I play a song and I'm just, really trying to feel like what is this song about? What do I hear when I'm hearing this music? What words seem to keep popping up in my mind? That's more along the lines of how I think Fleshkiller's lyrics seem to have panned out for the most part. There was less direct pre-song deliberation on maybe what topics we were doing, but they still clearly reflect our faith as Christians.
Much of the lyrics are pretty obvious as to who and what you're singing about, like Salt of the Earth, with the lyrics, thirst for unity, abide in the sun, grace will be your guide, be not afraid, you are the carriers of light. You're wanting to have the message clear instead of having listeners digging for the meaning?
Yeah, I think it does just sort of reflect a more emotive approach, I would say. You know, when I was writing some of the stuff for The Burial, a lot of it was, I was still kind of in that metal mode of just like hyper, think of the longest, most metal sounding words. And,
Seriously?
Oh yeah. I mean, there was lines that, like, as you're writing lyrics, you'll see that the sorts of things you're reading and you're listening to, those just sort of naturally become part of your vocabulary. And at the time when I was writing a lot of The Burial stuff, I was reading a lot of old, Reformation type theology. So, but those words were coming out because I was, reading, Luther's Catechism or, things like that. I think with Fleshkiller, it's a bit more heart language in that sense. That sounds like a super frou-frou way to say it. But when you're really feeling something and the words just come out, that is more like what Fleshkiller's lyrics are than a sort of like very sculpted, very preoccupied with vocabulary type lyrics that I personally tend to lean towards sometimes when I just start writing things down. But it's been a good change in approach. But I think part of that is reflective of the music as well, because we wanted a more sort of raw, aggressive, like old school 90s sort of vibe. And those lyrics weren't particularly intricate or wordy. They had a few things that they wanted to say, and they said it, clearly and succinctly.
that was Salt of the Earth, another of the tracks found on Fleshkiller's debut release, Awaken. That's a brilliant album from really stellar musicians. Couldn't recommend it more. Next time on The Antidote, we'll hear from Insomniac Folklore. This is a band known for their theatrical folk punk shows. They do this really odd blend of cheeky satire with an energy that has earned the band the label Tantrum Folk. Two of Insomniac Folklore's band members, Adrian and Tyler, come for a chat about their new release, Everything Will Burn. Tonight you've been hearing The Antidote's talk with Elijah Mullins of Fleshkiller, but I've only had enough time to air just part of that discussion. You can hear the rest of it on the interview section of theantidoteradio.com. But here is a bit more of that talk as Elijah shares about the future of Fleshkiller and about their single, Parallel Kingdom. See you next week. I was really taken by the first single from the Awaken release, Parallel Kingdom. I love that image of two worlds in parallel to each other. Where did the concept come from?
I think it's one of those things that we think of in the sense that there's this tension in Christianity where there's the kingdom of God, which we believe is, in our hearts, it's that, God is advancing the kingdom of God through us here on earth as, Christians. But there's also, in a more orthodox sense, the kingdom to come that has not yet come. And so there's this little bit of a tension that there's the always like now but not yet, I think is the way Paul likes to talk about it. And that sort of thing is what I believe most directly tied us to that theme of a sort of parallel kingdom, that you could be here on earth and still be thinking about that next one to come, but you should be striving to help make this place more like that place.
The Awaken album has really had a huge impact on me. What kind of an effect do you think it's going to have in the metal scene?
It's hard to say what sort of effect it will have. I know for me personally, it's been inspiring to get back in the saddle and take up some of this action again, and sort of be really thinking about this sort of stuff. But as long as somebody resonates with it and, finds some sort of peace or enjoyment out of what we do, that's really all we can ask for. We make music that we want to make, that we feel is reflective of the nature and like the goodness that God's shown us. But on top of that, we want people to be able to enjoy music and sort of maybe heal some of those things and be maybe a little less confrontational about certain aspects. I noticed that we have caught like some flack, not, massive amounts of flack, but we get a few comments here and there, which you get used to as a Christian metal band, that you've got the typical guy who says like, hey, this music would be great if you stop with all the Jesus stuff. And, you kind of just have to look at it and say like, hey, you know what, man, like, you're like totally 100% welcome to, keep listening to us and, keep accidentally listening to that Jesus stuff all the time. But we're not going to stop putting that out there from our perspective either, just because I think it's healthy to have that little bit of a dialogue, because there doesn't seem to be anything too absurd going on. As long as we get out there, we make music that we love to make, and we represent ourselves as people and as representatives of Christ, I think that's all the impact we can ask for.
And what's the next step for Fleshkiller? Have you got plans to tour this album?
We've been playing a couple cards pretty close to the chest. As of right now, we've got one in Oslo, Norway, the sort of perennial Christian metal fest in Oslo called Nordic Fest. We'll be playing there. I believe that's October 27th, and then there are a handful of festivals we're playing right after. We're playing in Amsterdam the weekend after, and in Stuttgart, Germany the day after that. So we've got a little bit of a spurt of touring on the back end there. But we do have plans, probably more so for next year, next spring, next summer, to kind of make a push and get a few weeks of touring in there.
Tell me it's North America.
That's, As of right now, all of our plans are in Europe. That's the goal, is next spring to have something lined up where we can come stateside and get a little bit of North American FaceTime with everybody here. Because that's always the question we've been getting asked the most. Part of it's just logistical. It's way easier to fly me over to Europe than it is to fly 3 guys over here. So from just a logistics standpoint, if the doors keep opening up, we'll keep walking right through them.
Hopefully that'll be happening. Elijah, thanks so much for coming for a talk with The Antidote. I really appreciate this.
Hey, thank you. Anytime. It's always a pleasure.